This is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another deck guide to another Modern video. This time we are doing Izzet Murktide in Modern. This is a tempo deck that is one of the more powerful decks in the format currently. It's kind of the spiritual successor to the various Delver decks that you especially see playing Legacy. Granted, there is no Delver of Secrets in the deck, but it is the tempo deck choice in the Modern format. And if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel, as we're going to be the most informative Modern channel for Magic on YouTube. So we're starting out with the creature base, which is kind of the heart and soul of every tempo deck. We start out with Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. When Ragavan Nimble Pilferer deals combat damage to a player, creates a treasure token, exiles the top card of their library, you can cast it until the end of turn. You can cast this for 1 red, and it's a 2/1, or you can dash it for 1 and a red, which comes into play with haste and returns to your hand at the end of turn. This little bugger is one of the more annoying cards printed in Modern Horizons 2, and a lot of people have called for a ban on the card already because they're quite frankly sick of playing against it. And its most notable comparison would be something like Deathrite Shaman in terms of most powerful 1-drop in Magic's history. As you know, you get both the treasure token to increase your mana as well as the top card of your opponent's library, and sometimes that can be quite swingy in terms of what you get off of your opponent's library, especially if you hit a key card out of their deck, or maybe you hit a key removal spell or something. So it's a very high variance card in terms of the top of your opponent's library, but very powerful in terms of just chipping away at damage. Another card that's important to the deck is Dragon Rage's Channeler. This is a 1/1 for 1 that has, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Surveil 1, basically you look at the top card of your library, you can choose to put it on top of your library or put it in your graveyard, and if you control 4 or more card types Delirium, you gets +2/+2 and attacks each turn, has +2/+2 flying, and attacks each combat if able. This is key to other elements of your deck, especially the namesake card Murktide Regent, which we'll get to in a second. And the latest card to be added to the deck is Ledger Shredder from Streets of New Capenna. This is whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, Ledger Shredder connives. Basically, that means you draw and discard a card. If it's a non-creature spell, they get +1/+1 counter. This goes for both players, so if any player casts the second spell each turn, this creature gets progressively bigger, and it's another way to cycle through your deck, find the key cards you need to find, and to also have a flying threat, in addition to Dragon Rage's Channeler and Ragavan, and is not as dependent upon the graveyard as some of the other elements of the deck. Namely, the namesake card Murktide Regent. Murktide Regent is a 3/3 for 7 mana, flyer, not the best deal, but it has Delve, which is relevant because whenever it enters the battlefield, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it for each instant and sorcery exiled with its ability whenever you cast it with Delve, and whenever an instant or sorcery card leaves your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on it. This means you can play multiple Murktide Regents and get them bigger and bigger. Ideally, you want to play the smaller one first, then play the bigger ones post after the first one, and get it bigger and bigger. Around this is among the most efficient spells in the format in terms of removal, counter spells, and interaction with your opponent, especially in the colors of blue and red. Sometimes you'll see splashes such as green or white, primarily for another threat, such as Tarmogoyf, or another answer for something like Prismatic Ending. It's kind of a universal answer to Graveyard Hate, which this is one of the keys to beating this deck. Another card you will see, which kind of goes in both the creature and spell part, is Brazen Borrower. Brazen Borrower is a 3/1 for 1 and 2 blue, flash flyer, which can only block creatures with flying. Not particularly relevant, but can come up on occasion. The big thing with this is Petty Theft, which is the adventure side of the card. Allows you to return a non-land permanent to an opponent's hand. Allows you to tempo your opponent a little bit out, potentially bounce it to their hand, and then next turn counter it on the way down. Gives you an answer to, a main deck Rest in Peace, or a main deck Leyline of the Void or something. Allows you to play your deck's game plan, while also having what would kind of be a sideboard slot kind of locked in the main deck that kind of fits in with the overall plan of the game. Beyond that, you have a lot of card selection in the deck, and things like Consider, Expressive Iteration, arguably the best cantrip and card advantage spell in the format, in terms of 2 mana for look at the top 3, 1 in your hand, 1 in the bottom of your library, 1 in exile. If you play this after turn 2, or sometimes on turn 2 with a Ragavan treasure token, oftentimes you'll be able to get a 2-for-1 out of this, being able to play a land, hit your land drops, etc., while also putting a relevant spell into your hand. This is one of the key cards to making this deck work, and one of the reasons it's become the most powerful. One of the most powerful decks in the format, if not outright the best deck. arguably battling with 4-color elementals / 4-color Omnath control for that role. You also get to play the card Counterspell, which there haven't been too many homes for the modern format since this card has been released in Modern Horizons 2. Primarily this in blue-white control are where you see the homes, as well as 4-color Omnath can sometimes play it, depending on how their deck is set up, whether they're a creature-heavier version or if they're a spell-heavier version. This is one of the iconic spells in Magic. It's 2 blue to counter any spell. And then you get to pair that with Spell Pierce and Archmage's Charm. Spell Pierce is obviously a very early interaction for your opponent's non-creature spells. 1 blue to counter non-creature spell unless its controller plays 2. Or you have Archmage's Charm, which is one of the most powerful modal cards in the modern format. For blue, you get counter target spell, draw 2 cards, or gain control of a non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. You can oftentimes target your opponent's Death Shadows, your opponent's Ragavans, many other different things, a Colossus Hammer if they haven't been able to equip it, Urza's Saga tokens, Rhino tokens, so many different things. And sometimes you can even steal a Germ on your opponent's Caldera Complete or their Batterskull, and if they don't have the ability to put it back in their hand, this can often swing the game in very surprising ways, as one of the harder cards to play around for a lot of decks. Another cantrip in the deck is Mishra's Bauble. This is just simply a 0 mana cantrip that allows you to draw a card during the next upkeep after you use it. Also gives you a little bit of information either about your opponent's deck, or you can use it in conjunction with fetch lands to filter the top card of your deck. And then you have Lightning Bolt, which is another iconic card in Magic, which allows you to deal 3 damage to any target. Or Unholy Heat, which pairs with Dragon Rage's Chandler as Delirium cards in your deck, can deal 6 damage to any creature or Planeswalker if you have Delirium. Otherwise, it deals 2. So not the best card as early interaction in the early game, but in the mid game, this can often kill almost anything in your opponent's deck, outside of opposing Murktide Regents, Death Shadows, and a few other creatures that can sometimes get out of range of this card. But it can even kill even some of the most powerful creatures in the format, like Primeval Titan, Wormcoil Engine, etc., which can be problematic cards as you're staring them down if they happen to get past your counterspells. Mana base, you are very much a blue-based deck, so you're playing basic islands. In addition to that, you're playing a bunch of fetch lands, some Steam Vents, some Spirebluff Canals, 1 Fiery Islet as a canopy land to be able to cycle, 1 Atawaru, the Soaring City, as kind of an interaction for your opponent. Gets to sneak another spell into your land. A lot of these decks are playing 18 or 19 lands, just depends on whether you want to hit your land drops consistently or not, how much you want to rely on your cantrips to hit them. And that's pretty much the main deck that you'll see. We'll see a few other options. We'll see a version, I think, with 4 Ledger Shredders in one version, and then one with none. This is kind of a newer addition to the deck, so it's not set in stone, this card, but it does feel overall with the theme of the deck. But most of the time you're closing out the game with Murktide Regent, although you can close it out with Dragon Rage's Chandler and Ragavan. And consider, I didn't kind of gloss over this one, this card is opt, but a little bit better for what this deck is trying to do. You look at the top card of your library, you may put that card in your graveyard, and then draw a card. So instead of putting it on the bottom of your library, you're putting it in your graveyard to fill your Delve, to fill your Delirium, etc. Sideboard, this deck has a few options as it's blue and red. One of the bigger reasons to stick to the blue-red variant as opposed to the other 3-color variants for the better answers or better threats is access to Blood Moon, which can be quite a devastating card despite the presence of things like Boseiju or Prismatic Ending in the format. That's why you'll see some of these lists go with 1 Magus of the Moon, 1 Blood Moon, as it does make it a little bit harder to key in on enchantment removal as a way to answer Blood Moon if your opponent's bringing in a Magus of the Moon, maybe they don't have a bunch of creature removal or whatever. Engineer Explosives, kind of a catch-all for a bunch of annoying things, whether it be Urza Saga tokens, Rhino tokens, Death Shadows, other opposing 1-drops like Dragon Rage's Chandler, Ragavan, creatures out of burn, etc., although it is a little bit slow in certain matchups. Relic of Progenus is kind of the graveyard hate of choice, as you do care about your graveyard quite a bit with the deck, so you can't really go and play something like, you could play Leyline in the Void or something, but you can't play like a hard graveyard removal for the most part, because you do care about your graveyard and you can't shut off your access, so you can't like splash away for something like Rest in Peace. But you do need a little bit of graveyard hate for sometimes for things like Reanimator or Dredge, which can be problematic matchups. This version's opting to go for a slot of anti-creature tech with Fury. This card is one of the Evoke Elementals powerful from Modern Horizons 2, which, as you'll notice throughout this deck, is basically Modern Horizons 2 deck. This one comes into play. deals 4 damage as you choose among any number of target players, not players, creatures or planeswalkers, and you may evoke it. That is, exile a red card from your hand, and that basically comes into play and dies immediately, but you still get the ATB effect. This deck doesn't play a ton of red spells, but this is still a very powerful thing, and there are some games where you get in the mid-game where you can easily cast this for 5 mana. Dress Down, this answers a lot of different things with enters the battlefield triggers. Your deck doesn't have a lot of enter the battlefield triggers, so you can use this to shut down things like Primeval Titan or a bunch of like elemental decks, etc., which can be a problem for this deck as they do tend to outgrind us. And it also kills Urza Saga tokens, making them lose all text, and they just die. Flusterstorm is your counterspell of choice against a lot of other opposing blue decks, especially combo decks like Rhinos. This allows you to kind of get around, them playing Mystical Dispute or something, and allows them, especially as the stack grows, allows you to fight them on that axis. Mystical Dispute, you're also playing against the blue decks for that very same reason. It's one of the most efficient decks against the other control decks and other tempo decks in the format, as there are a lot of those floating around with both Izzet Murktide and 4-color control, 4-color Omnath, however you wish to say. And then finally, one of the weaknesses of a tempo deck is the lack of threats, and if your opponent's able to answer your threats, and especially key in on your creatures, it can be problematic. So a lot of these decks play some type of tertiary threat in the sideboard. In this particular case, this deck is running Jace the Mind Sculptor as a source of card advantage, / another win con against some of the grindier decks, especially 4-color control, as you've heard me mention quite a bit, is one of the problematic matchups for the deck. Taking a look at another variant of the deck, as I mentioned, as far as the lands, this one's running 19, and is running snow lands as opposed to basic lands. This is only relevant in situations where you're hitting a snow deck or some type of snow deck, like say 4-color control with like Icefang Koalas and stuff, sometimes turning on their Death Touchers is relevant, although it's a corner case scenario that only comes up from time to time. But, other than not having your choice of basic lands, you're not really making much of a deck choice to lose Snow-Covered Islands, because a card like Redain doesn't see too much play in the modern format. As far as the main deck, the only notable thing with this deck is it's not playing Ledger Shredder, like the other one that we take a look at. Like I said, that's one that's still kind of under debate with the Murktide community right now. I have not had the opportunity to play with Ledger Shredder that much yet, so I don't really have an opinion on it one way or another, but it is a card that does seem to fit the strategy. It is relatively cheap as far as mana costs, and seems like it's a card worth including, or at least looking at some number of copies in your main deck. Sideboard, this one shows a little bit different options. You have more copies of Engineered Explosives and one less Fury, so you're kind of swinging in terms of what your catch-all answers are. The list of players seems to be a little bit less worried about creatures and a little bit more worried about 0 and 1 mana spells. Obviously, sometimes Fury can't deal with something like Urza Saga tokens, and Engineered Explosives can kind of clean that up quite nicely. Unlicensed Hearse is an interesting one. It's a different take on Relic of Progenitus. The cost of mana efficiency you are giving into another threat. Basically, Unlicensed Hearse is a 2-mana vehicle. Exile the top two target cards from a single graveyard. Unlicensed Hearse power and toughness are each equal number of cards exiled with it. You can crew it for 2, so basically almost every creature in your deck can crew it quite easily at some point, even though Dragon Range's Chandler, sometimes the 1/1 Ragavan, and Darcy can both do a good job of crewing this. And once again, you're kind of trading a little bit of slots here. You're giving up a little bit of efficiency with Relic of Progenitus for a little bit more of a threat plus disruption of your opponent's graveyard. Subtlety is a card that you play when you're playing against a bunch of blue decks or a bunch of planeswalkers or stuff that you're thinking your opponent might be bringing in, something like Cavern of Souls. This gives you a temporary answer to something like Primeval Titan through a Cavern of Souls. It allows you to continue to tempo your opponent. You can evoke this one for exiling a blue card, which this deck seems to have a lot of, and you can they choose to put it on top or bottom of your library, their library. The reason this one doesn't see play as much is, number one, your opponent has the choice. Number two, it's not the most mana efficient for what it particularly does, but a lot of the difficult cards for this card to answer, to Fairy Time Raveler and stuff, can be quite detrimental if it gets into play. So it's very important for this deck to have not only counter spells, but things that deal with uncounterable threats, which, like we will talk about in the third example of this deck, there are some uncounterable threats that do see play out there. This one's still choosing to run Jace the Mind Sculptor as its tertiary threats in the sideboard. You have some Mystical Disputes for the blue decks. This one's running 2 copies of Dress Down, so this one really doesn't like losing to Urza Saga tokens. This particular pilot was choosing to have a split on Flusterstorm and Spell Pierce. Spell Pierce, obviously more flexible in terms of being able to hit things like Planeswalkers and such, whereas Flusterstorm is much better in winning counterspell wars. The final list we're going to take a look at for Izzet Murktide is this list. This list is not running Ledger Shredder as I initially thought it was, but it did run a couple of cards in the sideboard that I do want to talk about. But the main deck, this one's also choosing to run 19, so 18 or 19 tends to be kind of the swing number, along with 3 islands. This deck used to play 1 copy of Mountain back in the day, but that was often the worst card to draw on the deck, and was only relevant in situations where you specifically had a Scalding Tarn to be able to go fetch up a Mountain to not take damage against something like Burn. A lot of people have moved away from that, and I do think that is the right direction. And this pilot with 19 lands is choosing to run 2 copies of Fiery Islet, so you're a little less punished for flooding out as you sometimes do with decks with this many cantrips. The main card that I wanted to focus on was Chandra Awakened Inferno, and while this card alone has difficulty beating something like 4-color control or blue-white control, it is a card that does require specific answers, as it obviously can't be countered. And we talked about, subtlety before in the previous deck list that we were talking about, how it's important to have answers to uncounterable threats, whether it be something through Cavern of Souls, Chandra Awakened Inferno, or it's Fairy Time Raveler if your opponent can sneak it through your counter magic. It's +2. Each opponent gets an emblem that deals them 1 damage each turn. It's -3, does 3 damage to each non-elemental creature. Not as great against the 4-color control deck, which is ideally where you want this card the most, because a lot of their creatures are elementals. And finally, you have -X, deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker. If it would die this way, exile it instead. So this is a very powerful card, but being 6 mana, you often have to split it with a Jace the Mind Sculptor, or you're only going to see 1 of this in the sideboard. It is a card that you will see. And one final card I will mention that's not in any of these particular lists, but was in a list that I did see. And as you're seeing a lot of cards with a deck like this, 1 or 2 of in your sideboard can be very, very important. And that is Torpor Orb, which basically means creatures entering the battlefield don't trigger abilities, which makes elementals very, very annoying. Or a lot of their annoying ETBs just go away. Although it does make their Furies a 3 mana, or a 3/3 double striker for discarding a red card. Something to keep in mind. Beyond that, like I said, you do see a lot of cards with the Izzet Murktide decks, so you can often have answers to just about anything you want. This deck struggles with decks that can answer all of its threats, so something like blue-white control with the right set of answers, or 4-color Omnath control or 4-color elementals with a bunch of solitudes and stuff can often be enough to overwhelm this deck. This deck does have a lot of card advantage and a lot of card selection, however it is not the most powerful in the format, and it's mainly its power is early in the game, seeing a lot of selection, but it can also be run over in the early game with a deck like Burn. Burn can often get unearned counterspells, can often deal with its early creatures, and if they can't get a quick Murktide Regent down, oftentimes Burn can just simply race or put themselves in a position where the Murktide deck is forced to tap out to answer their threats, and it can sneak in the final lethal burn spell or 2, especially if it's playing something like Exquisite Firecraft in the sideboard, which once again is another conditional not uncounterable spell, which is one of the ways to attack this deck, as it does rely heavily on its counterspells, as being blue and red doesn't have a lot of answers to a lot of different permanents, although it tries with Dress Down and Engineer Explosives out of the sideboard. What this deck preys upon is it preys upon a lot of the combo decks in the format. It also tends to prey upon decks like most of the Primeval Titan decks. Tron's a bit of a close matchup because you don't have the fastest clock, but you do have plenty of counter spells to what they're doing. You do have Blood Moon. So this is a deck that rewards type play, rewards a lot of powerful technical play, gives you a lot of agency in the decisions you make, gives you a lot of agency in the sideboarding decisions you make. As far as cards you will cut for sideboarding situations, it often depends on what you're up against. If you're up against a a deck without a lot of creatures, you might board out some of your lightning bolts, some of your unholy heats. You do generally want to keep in some of those answers, as a lot of the decks are running things like Solitude and Planeswalkers. So you do want some ways to answer that, but you might board those out to board some of your counter magic in, or you might board out some of your counter magic if you're up against something like Burn, where you don't always have time to hold up all the mana. You might shave like an Archmage's Charm, an Expressive Iteration. You don't have, or a Ragavan is a card you can also cut sometimes if your opponent's very good at gumming up the board, like something like Yawgmoth. You might leave it in on the play, as it's very devastating. You might board it out on the draw. You might shave a Mishra's Bauble. There's a lot of options with this deck, but a lot of the moving pieces are important. You'll often shave cards rather than cut copies of cards entirely, other than things like Lightning Bolt and Spell Pierce, which are cards that will come out in certain matchups. But overall, this is a very powerful deck. The mana is very consistent. The threats are very consistent. If you want to win, generally you want to keep a hand with a threat and some answers. If you want to beat this deck, generally you want to keep your creatures off the board, or just win in some ways in which they can't interact, such as problematic permanents that get past the counter spells, uncounterable spells, especially if you can keep their other things in check. Oftentimes, things like Shalander's Awakened Inferno, Teferi Time Raveler is one of the other ways to attack this deck very badly. And the final card that can also hit this deck is cards like Rest in Peace. While not on their own can shut down the deck, they do shut down the DRC and Murktide sides of the deck in terms of them being very powerful threats. Turns them into very, very pitiful creatures, although they still can be cast, they still can do things. It's not like Dredge, where the deck is almost completely shut down in the face of a hard graveyard hate piece. This deck, vulnerable to it, it helps the overall game plan, especially if you're a more controlling deck that doesn't utilize its graveyard as much. But it's not the be-all, end-all. You still have to find ways to deal with their other creatures like Ledger Shredder, Ragavan. You have to kill Darcy. Murktide Region can still be cast for 7 mana, although not the best. And so, this is one of those decks that does require some knowledge of how to beat it. It does require multiple steps to beat it usually. It's not just if you stop the graveyard, or you stop this, or you stop that, you win against this deck. This is one of those decks that, answering its threats is key, but you do have to close out the game yourself. And especially in the post-board games, it's going to be bringing in additional threats to counteract your opponent overloading on removal. And that's pretty much what I have for the deck. If you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel. And we're going to continue to try to push out a couple of videos of this type of week. If you do like this kind of content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hopefully see you for the next video.